Good morning. I open my talk today with an anecdotal story from one of the most famous anthropologists of recent years, Dr. Clifford Geertz. In his chapter in Contemporary Field Research, later republished in Thick Description, he notes, "There is a story from India about an Englishman who, having been told that the world rested on a platform, which rested on the back of an elephant, which rested in turn on the back of a turtle, asked, perhaps he was an ethnographer, it is the way they behave, what did the turtle rest on? Another turtle. And that turtle? Ah, Sahib, after that, it's turtles all the way down." All too often, people in our society naturalize our own culture's ways of acting and interpreting the world, presuming that our ways of doing things are the only logical way of constructing that world. Any different interpretations or actions are perverse, misguided, or simply wrong. For most Americans, culture is, at best, a superficial flourish to our taken for granted natural world. The anthropologist's presuppositions, however, are quite the opposite, setting out to capture, in the words of another famous anthropologist, the native person's point of view, his or her view of his or her world. Having lived and worked with people for multiple years from virtually all existing societies around the world, anthropologists know how vastly different cultures are, how they can come to be understood by following the logic of their languages and the everyday practices of people situated in different social circumstances within those societies, and how those languages and practices emerged in ever-changing historical contexts out of precedent cultural forms in relations of accord and opposition to other nearby societies and their coincident activities. I have been privileged to live and work for a good part of my life among Marshall Islanders in the West Central Pacific, among people who pursued their everyday lives in the most marginal of habitable locales as marine sailors and fisher folk, weavers and gatherers, but who, in the current day, have had to reformulate their lives as a result of external colonial influences, most notably missionization, the effects of World War II, the nuclear testing era that followed the war, and global climate change caused largely by humans in large-scale societies like our own. Today, however, I wish to talk more broadly about the major ways in which Pacific people in general come to formulate notions of their own persons in ways that contradict our own understandings of naturalness, and how those Pacific persons situate themselves in worlds that also contradict our views of how the world is constructed. In brief, as anthropologists have long understood, alternate worldviews are part and parcel of our alternate cosmologies or formulations of the universe, and alignments from top to bottom make these alternate cultural perspectives of critical value, particularly in a world where a very few powerful, large-scale societies worked tirelessly to force their own constructed worlds and their own forms of acceptable action onto others. As you use, we perpetuate many of our own culture's naive, but at the same time, naive biases, but at the same time, we covenant to respect the interdependent web of all existence, including cultural distinctiveness, with a goal of world community that certifies liberty and justice for all peoples. That cannot mean a world community of our own design, since to be just, it must also include accepting one another and seeking justice, equity, and compassion in all human relations. Finally, I would argue the responsible search for truth and meaning requires us to attempt to understand the perspectives of those whose truths, whose trothed or covenanted worldviews operate in accord with rules that, while 100% logical, radically contravene our own. My attempt today is to map some of the ways Pacific understandings do, in fact, differ radically from our own. With election season just behind us, with Black Lives Matter just prior, and with COVID-19 currently surging, we hear much in reactionary circles about trampling on individual rights. But in the Marshall Islands, where I conduct my research, it is nuanced notions of collectivities that are always placed in front of and above individuals and their selfish desires. Indeed, in spoken Marshallese, the entirely inadequate divisioning of persons into pronouns using I, you, and a gendered she, he, or it, and the plural I, we, or they, is exploded into a vast array of interpersonal arrangements of nuanced inclusion and exclusion. Notably, in this matrilineal society, gender is irrelevant to these arrangements. That is, there is no she, he, it divisioning of the world at the pronoun level. It is not a relevant condition of a person's rank or a state of being in the Marshallese interpersonal universe. Therefore, if in middle school you may have felt out of place when your friends said, "We went to the movie last night," when you were not asked to attend, Marshallese would say, "Kamaroaretel." The two of us, exclusive of you, the listener, went to the film, specifying the precise notion of the we being discussed. More importantly, Marshall Islands' cultural ethos would find it extremely rude when using the available possessives, mine, yours, etc., that affiliate persons and objects to say, "Look at this watch of mine." Rather, in a conversation with two others, one should say, "Lale waje o nezirjir." Look at this watch belonging to the three of us. In this case, the possessive also indicates a group of three people who are endeared to one another. And in following through on the irrelevance of objects versus the sanctity of interpersonal relations, if one of the threesome said, "Let me look at it," the person speaking would simply hand over the watch, knowing well they might never see their new watch again, but honoring the relationship, not one's relation to the object. And to add another flair of Marshallese interpretation, the watch is just not a thing. It is an endeared object, falling into the same category of valuable entities as children who must be cared for and nurtured. So the nezir part really means this watch, an offspring class thing that requires special care. By freely giving you the new watch, it is that endearment that I readily share to mark the critical nature of our relationship with one another. But in these Pacific worlds, universes are designed in which feeling is automatically a piece of every conceivable relationship among beings, and in which humans do not have dominion over objects or things. Uni Wikan, working in Bali, was among the first to demonstrate that Balinese live in a world that must be experienced through what she calls think feeling. In other words, our notion that thinking can be separated from feeling is absolutely false to the way Balinese, like members of most Pacific societies, talk about and experience the world. The Indo-European idea that thinking can be separated from feeling goes back to pre-Socratic times. But as recent psychological research has demonstrated, our divisioning of the world does not align well with the way in which psychologists feel human lived processes are thought to operate. And notice here how I cannot escape talking, when I'm speaking English, I cannot escape talking about think feeling without classifying into action as either thinking or feeling. Of course, the idea that thinking is separate from feeling aligns with the larger Euro-American mind versus body distinction. But that distinction is hardly universal in human societies and presents the same sorts of logical contradictions, separating entities that are in fact interwoven. Both these distinctions, mind-body and thinking versus feeling, invoke a plethora of other perverse cultural values, most critically, the gendered notion that it is males who think deeply with their mental faculties, while females naturally, or I should say, culturally, act emotively without thinking rationally about the outcomes of their actions. Presidential tweets notwithstanding. While missionization introduced Pacific people to the idea that humans have dominion over the earth, their own cosmologies obviate the artificial divide between humans and the natural world. Indeed, rather than blood coursing through the veins of Marshall Islanders, it is clan substance that is the symbol of shared identity among close relatives. For members of the Shark clan, it is sharkness, transmitted through women, that is shared with other members of their clan, whereas members of my own clan, Etchoa, share the substance of the taro plant, known as shoa. And given rules of incest, this means that all Shark or Taro clan members hold their identity sacred. Shark clan folks cannot eat sharks, nor can they have sexual relations with anyone who shares that female substance or covenanted prohibition. But they can communicate freely with sharks and bear no fear of sharks. When out swimming in the ocean, they see a shark and are absolutely not afraid of it, standing in the face of that shark. They have no fear since they share substance and exist in the world as alternate manifestations of the same form of being. While the interdependent web of all existence is taken for granted by Marshall Islanders, the nature of those interdependencies is radically different from our own, assuming continuities of being that interweave what we separate, humans and nature, and certainly not presumptively assuming that humans have a right to use nature willy-nilly for their own self-serving ends. Something similar holds for animate versus inanimate distinctions. Nowhere is this more clear than with Elizabeth Povinelli's writing about Belluan people on the Cape York Peninsula in Northern Australia. In her well-known article, Do Rocks Listen?, she highlights the widespread Pacific idea of an absolutely animate natural world. Indeed, amongst Belluan folks, not only do rocks listen, they actively participate in the lives of human beings who must consider their every action in relation to the world that is not around them, but an inherent part of them. When we listen to the distinctive sounds of the didgeridoo, we hear, perhaps, a haunting and unusual instrument that evokes the surreal. But the didge for Belluan folks replicates the tones of a finely tuned channel of communication between the living world of soil, rocks, sea, and air. And it provides humans with access to a world of active beings who exist in the longue durée and are extraordinarily real. While Marshall Islanders certainly have different cultural perspectives than Belluan people, they too understand that certain types of rocks are filled with animate spiritual force. Pumice, which floats to coral atolls from thousands of miles away, is one such inspirited type of rock with substantial influence over people's everyday lives. Equally, the spirits of ancestors, both recently deceased and ancient primordial beings, continuously interact with living humans and shape people's actions on a day-to-day basis. Wind, waves, turtles, birds, all of these things out there in the universe are active and frequently mediate these interactions, demonstrating to local islanders that they are truly but a small piece of a much larger and more perduring set of enlivened life forms in an ever-changing set of relationships that determine human futures. These few select features certainly do not fully define the distinctive characteristics of Marshall Islanders' lives, much less the highly varied contours of life among the members of a panoply of other Pacific peoples. My hope is that the few select items will only remind us to accept with great humility the distinct cosmological constructions of others whose perspectives are not only extremely different from our own, but can only come to be understood through years of sharing in the seemingly mundane details that form the warp and woof of each person's life, lived under specific contextual conditions within any one of these societies. Without truly living through these moments with other people, without living through them with others, without actively working to gain fluency in the languages and logics of practices far beyond our highly privileged, taken for granted perspectives, our understandings of others will always be highly restricted. Therefore, to commit to the UU principles we have covenanted to uphold requires extraordinary humility. It also requires us neither to fashion others out of those we do not know, nor to judge all living beings without exhausting all sources of understanding, including walking in their shoes. Without such commitments to interpersonal and intercategorical understanding, our covenanted principles remain either superficial, superfluous, or entirely hollow.